Well, good morning. As Cody said, I'm Gary Mark. I'm excited to be with y'all this morning to talk about our Catholic saints and hopefully to inspire you to create some relationships with some of the saints so that they'll walk with you on your own journey to sainthood. Just a bit of background about myself. I grew up just down Highway 59 in Louise. Like many of you, I've been involved in lay ministry, altar boy, lector, Eucharistic minister, all those things. My whole life, starting as a young boy at St. Procopius in Louise, moving on to St. Ignatius Martyr Parish in Austin, Ascension Parish in Bastrop, and now for the past 15 years, I've been at Sacred Heart Parish in Flatonia. At St. Ignatius, I met my wife, Jenny Patek Marek. She's originally from Yoakum. That Patek name is, it's out there in the Yoakum Shiner area. I've been blessed that Jenny is a strongly spiritual person, and we've now been helping each other grow on our shared faith journey for nearly 30 years. As y'all know, the theme of our conference reflects our hope that we can all journey to sainthood. Over the past 10 years, I've had a growing interest and passion in learning about and understanding the lives and roles of our Catholic saints. So that's why I'm happy to be able to share some of my thoughts with y'all, since our Catholic saints can be wonderful examples on our journeys to sainthood. Near the end of this presentation, I'll give a bit of testimony as to how I was called into this lay ministry of saints. I do want to say I've been a professional speaker more or less for the last 25 years, but that's mostly been through my career. I'm kind of a school facilities expert, and I used to work for the state government, now a nonprofit. So I do a lot of speeches at conferences and workshops and all that. And I've done a lot of youth ministry, high school age, CCD, religious education. So I'm definitely comfortable in talking to those kind of crowds. But this is the first time I've spoken at a truly religious themed conference. So if I stumble a bit or lose my way, be patient with me and I'll do my best. I did have a pulpit talk at Sacred Heart one day, and I was egging them on. I said, hey, if you come, you get to hear me ramble on about the saints for 40 minutes or so. And I was a little wrong. It'll probably be closer to 50. So I hope you feel like you've got some time to follow me. So I'm going to dive into the topic. As most of you know, there is a process to becoming a canonized saint within the Catholic Church. This is going to be a little bit academic, but I think it's kind of important to have this background. Now, up on the screen are some charts that I've found online. Those are really nice charts. They do a good job of laying out and describing the process and steps in an easy to understand manner. The first step to sainthood typically occurs 5 years after the death of a candidate. The local bishop is in charge of investigating a candidate's life, and this is where we currently stand in our diocese in the process with our local candidate, the late Father Charles Crom from Yoakum, whose life and ministry is currently under examination by the diocese. Now, Deacon Joe is going to have a talk this afternoon with more detail about Father Crom's life and his particular process. So typically when you reach the end of that diocesan examination process, it's common to begin to refer to the candidate as servant of God. And I don't think we're quite at that point yet with Father Crom, but hopefully we will be soon. So once you've got that local examination of a candidate's life complete, then the candidate moves to the second step. The diocesan report is sent to the Congregation of the Causes of Saints in Rome. If the committee and the Pope agree that the candidate lived a life of virtue, then we start referring to the candidate as venerable. The third step is beatification. This occurs after a miracle has been confirmed that the Church determines can be attributed to the intercession of the candidate. After beatification, the candidate is given the title of blessed. It's interesting to note that martyrs are usually automatically beatified as a miracle of grace. They don't have to have a separate miracle to be recognized on their behalf. And then the final step to sainthood, of course, is canonization. This occurs after a second miracle has been confirmed by the Church due to the intercession of the candidate, or in the case of a martyr, just one miracle. Once canonized by the Pope, we start referring to him by the title of saint. It is important to remember that the miracles are performed by God, not by the saints. The miracles are simply evidence that the saint is indeed in heaven, where the saint can directly intercede to ask God for his miracle. Just one final comment. Any person of any faith can reach heaven if God deems their life worthy. We just typically have no way of knowing for sure who might be in heaven. Just because our Catholic Church has a canonization process to recognize sainthood, we do need to remember that heavenly sainthood is not just reserved for Catholics. we can rest assured that the souls of many good people from other faiths have been rewarded by God with a place in heaven after their passing. Okay, that's the academic step. I shouldn't just flail my arms all around. Excuse me for a minute. Okay, so that's kind of the academic background. What I want to do now is just really dive into how the lives of our Catholic saints can be used to guide us on our own individual faith journeys, our own individual paths to sainthood. You know, if you put it simply, being declared a saint by the church, it just means that the church recognizes that the saint's life was so worthy that there is no doubt that the saint is in heaven. You know, we all have loved ones that have gone on before us, and I know we all hope that their lives were worthy of a spot in heaven too. My dad passed away in December 2008, and I hope he's in heaven. I mean, I guess it's possible he could still be in purgatory, but I do really believe he lived a life worthy of heaven. And that's the goal we all need to have, to live lives so worthy that God reserves a place in heaven for us too. Now, we probably won't ever have a formal Catholic canonization process, but we can still have that goal to become a saint in heaven. So once we have a canonized saint, what happens? Well, we name parishes and buildings after the saints. Their feast days are celebrated on the church calendar. We have pageantry and fanfare during and after the canonization process. So all of these types of things can result in both the church and its lay members raising the saints up on pedestals. And when we have them up on pedestals, it sends a subtle message that it must be really difficult to reach the level of worthiness that was exhibited by the saints. In a sense, we tend to make them superheroes. Okay, can't get my screen to change now. Can you move my screen, Terry? So, Dr. Meyer was impressed that St. Thor is up on the screen. Now, if you're a comic book or movie fan, you'll recognize these folks. That's Captain America, Thor, Wonder Woman, Superman. And these fictional superheroes, they all have incredible superpowers, you know, powers that we'll never have, that we're not capable of having. So when we have the saints on pedestals, like these superheroes, we start to believe that there is no way we can replicate the lives of the saints because they must have lived some kind of super holy, superhero life that we're not capable of replicating. And that's because of that, we fail to really explore and research their lives to truly understand the paths that they followed to heaven. And sometimes, you know, to me, it's reinforced by some of the articles and commentary that is written regarding our saints. Saints are often described as ordinary people who do extraordinary things. Now, I found a few examples of some headlines on the internet from Catholic articles, and I just want to show you that real quick. One headline said, "Saints are ordinary people who lived extraordinary lives." Another headline said, "Let the saints guide you to an extraordinary life." And final headline, "Saints, ordinary people doing extraordinary things." And of course, these articles are filled with great commentary and thoughts and all of that. But I always get hung up on that word extraordinary. Now, I'm going to get back to that in a minute. But first, let's think about what type of life Jesus asked us to lead in order to travel a path to heaven. The path that our canonized saints did their best to follow. So the Bible is full of advice for us. Whoops. Sorry. So from the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is asked, what is the first of all the commandments? And his reply is, I'm going to shorten this a bit. The Lord our God is the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. And the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no greater commandment than these. And then from the Gospel of John, Jesus there says, this is how all will know you are my disciples if you have love for one another. One of my favorite books of the Bible is the first letter of John. In the first letter of John, you'll find this wonderful verse. If someone who has worldly means sees a brother in need and refuses him compassion, how can the love of God remain in him? Children, let us love not in word or speech, but in deed and truth. And finally, I've got this passage from the book of the prophet Isaiah. Basically, this gives the same instructions for love, compassion, and forgiveness. But it's important to know, and even today's reading from Isaiah was similar. It's important to know that love is, and testimony to love in the Bible is not just limited to the New Testament, but it's found in abundance in the Old Testament too. So in studying these and other verses, in the Bible, one thing becomes really clear to me. It's quite clear that our journey to heaven must be built on love. Now, Bishop Cahill's homily on sin was really a great setup to my next point. To follow this path of love, we do first have to recognize our own sinfulness, and we have to do our best to conquer and control our sinfulness. There is no greater barrier to love than sin. So in what ways is sin a barrier? If your heart is distracted by hatred and bigotry, then you have a barrier to love. If your heart is prone to anger and distrust, then you have a barrier to love. If your heart is consumed by grudges and pettiness, then you have a barrier to love. If your heart has any of these, and many of the things Bishop Cahill mentioned in the homily, if your heart has any of these and you don't make efforts to resolve them, your journey to heaven is going to be difficult. So to find a path to love, you really have to turn inward and examine your heart. You have to recognize your own sinfulness and then take steps to turn away from sin. Because when you begin a path to love, these are the things that you'll discover will flow from love. Love itself, in greater measure, flows from love. Compassion flows from love. Forgiveness flows from love. The desire to serve flows from love. We have to learn to remember and to make it the forefront of our daily thoughts that God lives in all of us. He lives in the poor. He lives in the homeless. He lives in people of color. He lives in gays and lesbians. He lives in people with different political views. When we ignore these people or look past these people or put down these people, we're ignoring God. God loves all these people. He asks us to love them too. So you may be wondering, how do we show this love to everyone? What are some of the ways we can show this love to everyone? There's a lot of spiritual guides out there. For me, I like to find inspiration from the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. The works of mercy are found in the teachings of Jesus, and they give us a wonderful day-to-day guide for how we should treat all others while living a life of love. And as you can see, the corporal works of mercy, which kind of means you have to kind of take physical action to do these things, they are feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless, visit the imprisoned, visit the sick, and bury the dead. And the spiritual works of mercy, which are really focused obviously more on the spiritual, prayerful side, are instruct the ignorant. Closer? Okay. Instruct the ignorant, counsel the doubtful, admonish the sinner, bear wrongs patiently, forgive offenses willingly, comfort the sorrowful, pray for the living and the dead. And you'll actually find this prayer card in your bag today. We did run out at a certain point, so it's possible you may not find one in there. Now, a list like this can often sound a little bit academic and maybe a bit hard for some folks to relate to. The writers for America magazine, which is a Jesuit publication, recently took a look back at some of Pope Francis's homilies and speeches from 2022 and found that this was his advice for building stronger relationships with God, with our neighbors, and with the earth. First piece of advice was volunteer for a local charity or nonprofit. Stop judging others. Take scripture to heart. Take one concrete step to become more environmentally conscious. Pray every day, even when it's hard. Let go of a grudge or two. Get off Twitter. Call your loved ones regularly and truly listen to them. I need to get off TikTok. That's very distracting. So, as promised, let me get back to why I get hung up on the word extraordinary. Now, all these actions that we're asked to follow, either from the works of mercy or from Pope Francis, they're all centered on loving God and loving our neighbors. So why is it considered extraordinary when we show love instead of hate? Why is it extraordinary when we help the poor? Why is it extraordinary when we show compassion and mercy? Why is it extraordinary when we engage in prayer? Why is it extraordinary when we forgive? All of these actions should be an ordinary part of our everyday Christian life. It should be what we strive to do every day. It shouldn't be considered some great, extraordinary accomplishment when we simply do what God asks of us. Now, I don't claim to, have any great vision on this particular viewpoint. As you can see from this quote from the Venerable Cardinal Francis Xavier Wynne van Thuan, where he so eloquently expresses the same thoughts. Cardinal Francis says, "Saints do not become saints through acts of prophecy or performance of miracles. They do nothing extraordinary at all other than faithfully carrying out their ordinary duties." It's clear to me that living an ordinary life that's filled with acts of compassion and forgiveness, and having hearts that are full of love and compassion and forgiveness, is what is necessary to reach our heavenly goal. To stay inspired on our journeys and to learn how to stay on our heavenly journeys, I recommend becoming familiar with our Catholic saints, since they provide wonderful examples of living lives of love that can guide and assist us. And by establishing ongoing prayer relationships with saints that you find special and inspiring, I think you'll find that the saints can be your companions on your journeys. So who are some of the saints, and what are the stories of their ordinary lives? After studying about the lives of saints, the lives of the Catholic saints, I like to kind of contemplate on their journeys and the paths they took on their saintly faith journeys. And I've kind of, in studying them, see 4 paths that I think can generally be applied to our saints. And these are just the way I like to group them. It may be that other folks that study the saints have them grouped a little bit differently. But generally, the paths followed by our Catholic saints, the first path is being a martyr. These are basically folks that have given their lives in defense of their Catholic faith. Another path is being a mystic. This includes people who have received the stigmata, those who have had visions of Mary, and those who have received vivid messages through their dreams. Still another path is being a servant. These are folks who have lived lives that serve the poor, the sick, the homeless, those generally ignored or discarded by society. And the final path is being a contemplative. These are people that have dedicated their lives to prayer, fasting, sometimes solitude, and perhaps spiritual writings. Now, most of our Catholic saints are remembered for living their lives by following primarily one of these paths. But the reality is that their lives, and probably like ours to some degree, reflect some aspects of all those paths. I believe the church recognizes over like 10,000 saints. They've all got wonderful stories and lessons. I'm going to share some brief stories about 8 different saints that I really admire and the lessons their lives can teach us. So to start, we'll look at a couple of our martyr saints. I'm going to start with a World War II martyr, St. Maximilian Kolbe. Father Kolbe was a Polish Franciscan priest. During the war, he helped hide persecuted Jews and Poles, and his friary published many religious publications along with anti-Nazi publications. Because of his resistance to the Nazis, in 1941, Father Kolbe was arrested and sent to Auschwitz. After some time there, he one day volunteered to take the place of one of 10 men that were going to be starved as punishment. The man he replaced was a husband and a father, and that man he replaced did survive the camp and did survive the war. After 2 weeks of starvation, the last survivors, Father Colby and 3 others, were executed with injections of carbonic acid. St. Maximilian Kolbe's life is an example of sacrificing for others. Of course, he gave the ultimate sacrifice. He gave his own life for another. We can follow his saintly example on a more day-to-day basis by being willing to make sacrifices for our families, our friends, for those down on their luck. It's often difficult to give up your personal time or your personal money and belongings to help someone. But when we do, I'm sorry, excuse me. But when we do make those sacrifices, we are taking positive steps on our saintly journey. Another notable martyr is St. Maria Goretti. Maria was a young Italian girl. She was born in Italy in 1890. After the death of her father, since her family was poor, they moved in with a neighbor family. The neighbor family had a 20-year-old son named Alessandro. So in 1902, when they were alone working on chores around the home, Alessandro began making sexual advances to Maria, and Maria was only 11. After resisting him several times over the course of a couple of months, one day Alessandro eventually became so angry, he stabbed Maria 14 times. Maria would die 20 hours later, but on her deathbed, she forgave Alessandro, saying, "Yes, for the love of Jesus, I forgive him, and I want him to be with me in paradise." Alessandro was sent to jail with a sentence of 30 years. He remained angry for many of those years. But Maria eventually appeared to him in a dream, and it said that in the dream she was clutching 14 lilies, one for each stab wound. After the dream, Alessandro soon realized that Maria had forgiven him, and he was able to lose the anger that had dominated his life. Alessandro was released after 27 years and sought out Maria's mom to ask forgiveness. Maria's mom forgave him without hesitation because she knew Maria had already forgiven him. Alessandro would find work as a gardener in a monastery and eventually became a lay brother of the Capuchin order. And Alessandro was present when Maria was canonized. So the person that took her life found redemption and was present when she was canonized. Now, St. Maria is remembered as a patron of chastity, since she gave her life to preserve her virtue. And using Maria as an example for our young people is definitely a good practice. But the aspect of Maria's life and death that I find so compelling is her ability to forgive. She forgave Alessandro for his actions and hoped she would see him in heaven someday. She forgave the person that caused her death. Let's just think about some of the minor grudges and perceived slights that we hold against other people that we don't want to let go of. Those pale in comparison to what Maria experienced. It's a lesson we need to learn from that Maria teaches us, that we must forgive others. So just a final thought about martyr saints. You might wonder how martyrdom can be an ordinary action. Surely that has to be considered extraordinary. But think about this. Most of us here are some combination of husbands, fathers, brothers, teachers, friends. If you had to make an instantaneous decision in an unforeseen moment of crisis, could you give your life to protect your wife or girlfriend, your child, a student you teach, a friend? I want to believe that most of us could give our lives. And I think that should be an ordinary way to think about protecting our loved ones. When you really think about that, it doesn't seem outrageous. Think of the teachers at school shootings like Uvalde. When they found the bodies of the deceased teachers, they were in positions that made it obvious that they had tried to use their bodies to shield some of their students. I remember when I was a high school student in Louise in the mid-1970s, we had a speech and drama teacher named Mr. Trainer. He was escorting a student group on a summer tour of Washington, D.C. in 1975. The story we heard at the time that was some of the students were near or crossing a street when a vehicle came suddenly roaring down, and Mr. Trainer was able to push a student out of the way, but he was hit by the vehicle and he died soon thereafter. Mr. Trainer, like all of us, was not a perfect man, but I'm sure God honored his sacrifice that day. Now I want to move on to a couple of mystic saints. Most of us have heard about the appearance of Mary at Lourdes in France in 1858. Saint Bernadette was a 14-year-old peasant girl that had 18 visions of Mary at a grotto near a spring. Now, Bernadette was not initially sure who the vision was, but Mary did eventually identify herself as the Immaculate Conception. The message that Mary consistently relayed to Bernadette was to do penance and to pray for sinners. There was a small spring there that had always been muddy, but it miraculously began to flow more strongly with clear water. There is now a shrine and basilica at the site, and many healings are reported by those who bathe in the springs. Bernadette was embarrassed by the attention, and she chose a life of solitude in a convent by becoming a nun and joining the Sisters of Charity. St. Bernadette would die from tuberculosis at the young age of 35. What do we learn from St. Bernadette that can help us on our journey? We learn that we need to be open to hearing God's voice and to choose prayer and solitude when needed. And again, you may be saying, well, having visions of Mary or hearing a message from God, that's not ordinary. But think about this, at times when you're making a tough decision in your life, when one direction is obviously very good, but very difficult, or the other direction is a much easier path, but generally has a lot of bad consequences. You know you hear those voices in your head while considering the options. And there's that one voice that tries to convince you to take the good but difficult option. That is the voice of God trying to help you down that saintly path. And if you really open your eyes and listen and observe, God's sending you messages all day long. I was kidding with some of the team earlier. He woke me up at 4 o'clock this morning because he said I needed to make some changes in here. So, he's out there talking to us, and we just need to kind of open our eyes and listen and hear it. Now, another mystic saint is Saint Padre Pio. Now, Padre Pio was an Italian priest of the Capuchin order, and he had a desire to suffer for the transgression of mankind. For the last 50 years of his life, he bore the marks of stigmata, the wounds of Jesus, on his hands, feet, side, and chest. He was well known throughout the region of Italy where he lived, and he was respected as a confessor and spiritual advisor. He's said to have been able to bilocate, which means being seen in 2 locations at one time, to have fought off poltergeist-type demons, and have had visions of Mary, Jesus, and the angels. So I guess if you're going to say there was a handful of saints that might be a bit extraordinary, maybe Padre Pio gets that for some of those items. But St. Padre Pio, he died in 1968 at the age of 81, and he's remembered as one of the great miracle workers in Christian history. While there are many skeptical people who try to question or raise doubts about the occurrences in Padre Pio's life, the church thoroughly researched and documented his life, resulting in his canonization to the sainthood in 2002. So can we be a stigmatic? Well, most likely we won't be blessed with the visible stigmata like Padre Pio. However, I would bet we all carry scars, some physical, some emotional. From the physical standpoint, I have a 10-inch scar on the side of my hip from surgery to repair a broken hip socket that I suffered in an auto accident in the year 2000. Now, I'm sure many of you maybe have similar scars from accidents or surgeries or the like. And then we all have emotional scars. Might be from the loss of a loved one, from the end of a relationship, in similar situations. We can walk that same ordinary path as the stigmatic saints by relying on prayer, persistence, and love when difficult and painful situations face us. Now moving on to a couple of servant saints. St. John Bosco was born in Italy in 1815 during a time of shortage and poverty. At the age of 9, John had dreams which led him to believe that God was calling him to work with youth. After having to work during his own youth, he was finally able to join the seminary and was ordained in 1841. John moved to the city of Turin, where he was saddened by the large number of orphans and poor boys he observed living alone there. John saw that these boys were vulnerable. They were vulnerable to being uprooted, exploited, or just to losing hope. Now, John worked to provide the boys with education, religious instruction, and recreation. Eventually, he built a grammar school, a technical school, and a church. He had some initial resistance from some of the locals, but he continued to grow his programs. And he eventually founded the Salesians Holy Order. And before he died in 1888, it had spread to numerous other countries. The Salesians still prosper to this day, continuing the mission and work of St. John Bosco. Now, another service saint is St. Teresa of Calcutta. Now, St. Teresa was born in 1910 in what is now Macedonia with the birth name of Agnes. At the age of 18, she joined the Sisters of Loreto to become a missionary to India. She took her first vows as a nun and took the name Teresa and began her missionary work as a teacher. At age 36, the suffering and poverty she observed in Calcutta made a deep impression on her, and she felt called from God to help the poor of India. Other women would join Teresa, and so she formed the Missionaries of Charity, which was dedicated to caring for the hungry, homeless, naked, and all other outcasts of society. St. Teresa was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979, and she continued to work almost up until her death in September 1997. She was canonized by Pope Francis on September 4th, 2016. By 2020, the Missionaries of Charity had over 5,200 sister members working in over 100 countries. So her influence still lives with us today. St. John Bosco and St. Teresa of Calcutta dedicated their lives to service. So how can we do the same? We can work at a food pantry or a soup kitchen, repair homes and mow yards for the poor, elderly, or sick, volunteer at schools and hospitals. The corporal works of mercy that I mentioned earlier provide great guideposts for living service-filled lives. So for our final group of saints, let's move on to the contemplative saints. Saint Elizabeth of the Trinity, a lot of folks don't know about her, but she's a fairly recent saint that I just adore. Saint Elizabeth of the Trinity was born in 1880 in France. As a youth, she had a horrible temper. And I think because I worked with youth groups so much through my life, I could relate to kids with bad attitudes. So I like her as a model because she had a horrible temper, but after her first communion in 1891, she gained more self-control and had a deeper understanding of God. As a teen, Elizabeth visited the sick, sang in the church choir. She was actually a gifted pianist and taught religion to children. At the age of 17, Elizabeth and her mom visited with the Mother Superior of the Dijon Carmel. The Mother Superior exposed Elizabeth to the writings of the Carmelite Saint Therese of Lisieux. Elizabeth had a strong calling to the Carmelite life, and finally at age 21, her mother allowed her to enter the Dijon Carmel. St. Elizabeth had a love of the Trinity and wrote several significant works related to the Trinity. Elizabeth would die in 1906 at the age of 26 due to Addison's disease, a disorder that had no cure at the time. Though her death was painful, she gratefully accepted her suffering as a gift from God. So Elizabeth's life is a model for prayer, solitude, and contemplation, and at the end of her life, a model for accepting suffering. The final saint I'll share about today is Saint Brother André Bessette. Born in 1845 in Canada, Alfred Bessette battled sickness and weakness from the time of his birth. By the age of 12, both parents had died. He tried to find work, but his poor health just caused him to be a failure at most of his efforts. At age 25, he applied for entrance into the Congregation of Holy Cross, but after a year's novitiate, he was not admitted due to his weak health. But at the urging of a bishop who admired Alfred's strong faith, he was finally accepted, and he took the name Brother André. He was given the simple job of doorkeeper at Notre Dame College in Montreal, with additional duties as sacristan, laundry worker, and messenger. And he worked at these simple tasks for over 40 years. Now, Brother André had a great devotion to St. Joseph, and every night spent much time in prayer and devotion with St. Joseph. André had a desire to build a great chapel in dedication to St. Joseph, so he began collecting small donations for construction. The First chapel was small and simple, and Brother Andre began receiving visitors there and prayed with them. Through the years, many people who prayed with Brother Andre were cured of various ailments. Andre never took credit. He said that the healing came through the intercession of St. Joseph. The small chapel continued to be enlarged and improved upon, and 50 years later, the magnificent oratory of St. Joseph, standing on Mount Royal in Montreal, was completed. St. Brother Andre, who struggled with poor health in his early years, would die in 1937 at the age of 92. So if that's not evidence that God rewards you for strong faith, he took a sickly young boy and gave him a long life in 92 and funneled many great works through him. From Brother Andre's life, we learn the importance of humility, wisdom, and childlike faith. Now, I really encourage y'all to reflect and research on the saints. There are so many saints and wonderful stories out there. Now, most likely, y'all all have a baptismal or confirmation name of a saint. If so, maybe research that saint and learn more about their lives. Maybe include them in your prayer life. Or find a patron saint that is important to you and begin to include them in your prayer life. A lot of trades have patron saints. There's probably a patron saint to plumbers, for example, and carpenters. If you notice on the saints that I've talked about this morning, their lives were mostly within the past 200 years. Now, for me personally, I just find it easier to relate to their lives because they're not that far removed from our present times. And so they just seem really real to me because their history is so recent. However, there is great value too in studying the lives of older saints dating back to the time of Jesus. So it may be for you that you find saints from other eras to be more enlightening in your own journey. Going back, we have many great examples. Saints like the apostles, St. Mary of Magdala, St. Monica and St. Augustine, St. Peregrine, St. Ignatius of Loyola, St. Francis and St. Clare of Assisi, St. Vincent de Paul, and St. Anthony of Padua. We're all different, but we all should identify a few saints and invite them through prayer to walk with us in our daily journeys. I have a short litany of saints that I pray to daily, and these are saints whose lives have special meaning to me. Now, I know I've mostly focused on our individual journeys today about, traveling with the saints and learning about the saints. But I do want to remind you that it is okay to seek out other men, maybe within your parish or in prayer groups or whatever, to journey with you. It's a lot easier to take a journey when you're not traveling alone. Now, I'd like to share with you now how my faith journey brought me to such a strong appreciation of our Catholic saints. If we go back a bit earlier where I talked about how important it is to overcome bigotry and hate and to accept love as the guiding force in our lives. For me, among many other things, I had personal journeys in trying to conquer several bigotries from my youth. In particular, these were racism and homophobia. And I'll share just a bit of testimony about my journey in overcoming those two bigotries. Now, growing up in Louise in the 1960s and 70s, it was typical to hear the white residents of the community, and that also included my family members and sadly included me too, to use the N-word to describe the black residents of the community. And it was also common to use derogatory words to describe the Hispanic residents of the community too. I observed many people that had a hatred towards people of color, but for most, and this is how my family was, we just felt that our white skin somehow made us superior to people of color. So after graduating high school in 1977, I had enrolled at Wharton County Junior College. And there I met a young black man named Walter. And we actually became friends. Along with another new white friend from the area named Bill, we decided that the three of us would be roommates when we transferred to the University of Texas in the fall of 1979. Even though I had become friends with Walter, I still had that underlying racism living there in my heart. Because of similar class schedules, Walter and I ended up sharing the larger of the two bedrooms in the apartment. Walter had a strong Christian faith. He would not go to sleep at night until he read his Bible. He would engage me in conversations about faith, And I eventually figured if he was going to keep me up reading his Bible, that I should get a Bible and read every evening too. It was kind of the typical young Catholic. I really hadn't cracked the Bible much, so thankfully Walter helped me on that journey. So anyway, from this interaction, a spiritual bond began to form between us. And at the same time, I was able to step back and see firsthand, up close, the daily effects of day-to-day cultural racism on Walter's life. The things that were said to him, the glances he got. People looked at us, a black friend and a white friend together, and I'm sure just thought evil thoughts of us. After all of that, my sin of racism finally began to melt away. I realized that Walter was a child of God, no different from me. His skin color made no difference in how I felt about him. I truly began to love him as a brother. I'm a better person because of the spiritual influence of Walter in my life. We don't really get to see each other or talk very often, but to this day, Walter continues to live a strong spiritual life and is deeply involved with his church in Houston. So eventually, I graduated from UT, entered the Austin job market. And in that job market, I started encountering gays and lesbians in the workplace, with several among my many coworkers. Again, growing up in a small town, I had that built-in homophobia. I thought all homosexual people were horrible and to be avoided. But after some time working with some gay men and lesbian women at different jobs that I had, I realized that most of them were just good people trying to make the best of life. And I became good friends with most of them. These sincere friendships ultimately helped me to overcome that sin of bigotry too. So thankfully, I was able to put those two particular bigotries behind me and learn to love as God asked us to. But I still face battles against other sins that slow me down on the path of love. For example, gossip is one that I'm still susceptible to. I'm just too often too eager to hear the latest dirt or scoop on someone. Man, that's a battle I fight constantly. And then Bishop's sermon this morning, he's listing off these sins, and I'm kind of, and maybe a lot of us were doing that. So that battle against sin, it's a tough one. So anyway, up until about 10 years ago, I really didn't think about the saints that often. I knew what they represented, but I had them up on those pedestals and didn't really feel strongly attached to them. Then one day, in 2013, we got an envelope in the mail, or it may have been 2012 even. We got an envelope in the mail from the Padre Pio Foundation of America asking for a donation. And we're on a lot of charity address lists apparently. But anyway, they included what they described as a relic of St. Padre Pio. Now this piqued my interest because I knew just enough to know that relics were some personal connection to the saints. So in doing some research, I soon figured out that this relic I received was a third-class relic, in that it was a piece of cloth that had been touched to a first-class relic of St. Padre Pio. But between this research and getting this relic, all of a sudden, there was just this awakening in me of a real interest to learn more about the saints and their relics. So in a way, I have to thank Padre Pio for interceding in my life and guiding me on this journey. Now, just a quick lesson in the classes of relics. A first-class relic is typically some part of the body of a saint. It can be a piece of bone, skin, hair, or the like. Second-class relic is usually a piece of clothing that was worn by the saint. And a third-class relic, as I mentioned before, is typically a piece of cloth that was touched to a first-class relic of the saint. So anyway, I was kind of inspired to start researching and learning about relics, which eventually led me to exploring various online stores and resources. I began to acquire and rescue some second and third class relics, mostly in the form of prayer cards. I also wrote to some congregations and holy orders with requests for second class prayer cards of some of the saints and blesseds within their communities. At some point, I had written to the congregation that was founded by the Italian nun, St. Gertrude Comensoli, with the hope of obtaining some relic prayer cards. And instead, we were surprised and blessed to be gifted a first-class relic of St. Gertrude. So that's really special. I mean, that's a bit of her body there. So for a few years, I was happy to have rescued a few prayer cards and to have been personally gifted the very special relic of St. Gertrude. And then I kind of, faded away and didn't really pursue those efforts much more. So then, jumping forward to 2016, we took a family vacation in the Albuquerque and Santa Fe areas in New Mexico. In old downtown Santa Fe one day, we walked into the Cathedral Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi. Within the cathedral, they had a display case of maybe 15 to 20 first-class relics. I just stopped and admired them, and standing there in front of them, all of a sudden, I just felt this joy awakening in me, and just inspiring me again on this path to study the relics. So anyway, upon our return home in the coming months and years, my wife and I, and actually to be honest, it was mostly me, but I at least had her blessing, began somewhat aggressively exploring the internet to find unwanted Catholic saint relics, purchasing them and bringing them home to a loving and appropriate spiritual environment. Now, yes, we probably spent a bit too much money doing this, but in the end, we had rescued about 100 relics or so that most likely would have ended up in the hands of collectors or non-believers who would not have given them the spiritual respect they deserved. Our dining room at home now also serves as a mini chapel with all these relics lovingly displayed. I like to say when I have friends over, especially Catholic friends, that there's no way any evil spirits will enter our house with all these saints standing guard. So you do sleep good at night. Out in the country, you hear the animals and all, and knowing the saints are there. So anyway, in the process of rescuing these relics, I began to research and study the lives of each saint whose relic we rescued. I wanted to know their story. Who is this person, that I've rescued their relic? And in that study, I began to understand the journeys they had in their lives and how they faced similar obstacles and problems just like we do in our lives. And I began to finally understand how in the ordinary course of my day, I could learn to make decisions and choices that were based on love. Decisions and choices that would put me on a similar path as these saintly role models. For my wife and I, we now understand that we have been called to share the stories of the saints, to share the relics, and to encourage everyone to examine their lives and to do their best to follow the saintly paths. There are 28 saint and blessed relics on display today in the St. Gregory room. So if you go through the cafeteria to where the vendors are, you'll see them back in that area. I hope you find some time to visit and spend time in reflection and veneration. Remember, when we venerate and pray to a saint, we are simply having a conversation where we ask the saints, since they are in heaven in close relationship with God, to intercede with God on our behalf. I mentioned that our family inventory was about 100 relics, but the church only allows public display of relics that have proper certification documents. Now, I'm confident that the relics my wife and I have are all authentic, but most paper documentation was lost through the years prior to our rescue. So we have only a small number with all proper documentation. So those are the relics that are on display here today. I'm hoping one day to get some additional documentation on the others that would allow me to display them, but that's a separate challenge for me right now. So it's important to understand that my wife and I do not have a collection of relics. It's not a hobby, but for us it's a calling. What we have is a group of relics that we felt called to rescue. And that picture up there, that's just a small sample of how they're displayed at our house. Now, I like to contrast this to my other actual hobby I have, which is collecting autographed cards of baseball players in the Hall of Fame. And as you can see from that picture, I've gone greatly overboard on that hobby too. I think there's like 600 something autographs. But anyway, as you can see, I have quite a few. So in my collection, I have several Mickey Mantle autograph and jersey cards. Mickey was my first hero as a child. So it's kind of cool that I can hold these cards in my hands knowing they were connected to him. I actually have, hang on, I've got to move. Now, I actually have a card with me today, and it's kind of cool that I can hold this card and know that Mickey held it and signed his name on it. It's just for me, it makes a connection to a really cool guy that I really admired when I was a young boy. So, a special aspect then of venerating a relic is that it can allow you to feel physically close to the saint. You can touch or pick up the display and know that you are in the direct presence of the tiny part of the saint's body or clothing. And if you do go there today, please feel free to pick up the relics, to hold them, to admire them. It's kind of hard, they're down low, to bend over and look at them. But please understand that there is no magic in a relic. But a relic can be a conduit to inspire interest in learning more about the saint's life. That's obviously what the relics have been to me. Now, we do hope that after maybe you create a relationship with a saint, and maybe you've been sick or ill, that maybe you can get some healing, but that healing doesn't come from the relic. That healing comes from the intercession of that saint. So really 2 miracles happen when that happens. You've got the healing, but you also started praying. So anytime we learn to pray more, that's a wonderful miracle to me. So why does the church allow relics? Well, one reason is that the church understands that not everyone can travel around the world to visit and pay respects at the burial places of all the saints. And so by distributing a limited number of these small relics throughout the world, it provides more opportunities for folks to pay respect to the saint's body. In essence, the relic case is really a mini coffin, and you can kind of see that one up there. It's just an enclosed little case about 2 inches across. Basically, it's kind of like visiting the grave of a loved one. You're paying respect to their relics, which are buried there in the ground. That's a picture of my dad's grave at the St. Procopius Cemetery in Louise. And whenever I can, I like to stop by there and pay respect and say prayers. So I will add that if you feel really called to visit the graves of some saints, you don't have to travel overseas to do so. There are several graves of saints that you can easily visit in the United States. St. Junipero Serra in California, St. John Neumann and St. Catherine Drexel in Philadelphia, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton in Maryland. So I am at a point where I need to wrap this up, but I really hope you can find inspiration from the lives of our saints. That you leave here today and seek out and educate yourselves about a few of them and begin to make them a part of your daily prayer life. I'll finish with one particular Bible quote that I think is fitting for our theme today. It's this verse from Isaiah, chapter 64, verse 8. Yet, Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you our potter. We are all work of your hand. Sometimes we might be prone to think that we're too set in our ways or too old to change. I don't care if you're 20 years old, 50 years old, or 80 years old. God knows that you're clay that can still be shaped and formed. So know that God wants you to be shaped by love, to find that path to heaven by living an ordinary life. Thanks for letting me share with y'all today.